Let's talk about plastic and cardboard today. I know, so exciting. Hey everyone, it's Thomas Wooden Railway, and if you're a fan of the Thomas & Friends Wooden Railway merchandise line, you will know that the packaging for the toys really didn't change for the first 25 years of the line's existence. I'm not talking about the actual colors or anything, I'm more talking about the general design and gist of the packaging. Here we have an item from the early 1990s, main color here being green, and then a couple years later we moved over to this design, which still keeps the cardboard back and sort of like the plastic window here so you can see the item, but we started to get into an era where one of the primary colors being used on the boxes was actually blue. And this remained a staple for the packaging for a number of years. As the package and the boxes changed as time went on, we really kept this blue cardboard backing and then kind of went for like yellow and red being more secondary colors. And like I said, this continued for basically 25 years until the original Thomas & Friends Wooden Railway ceased production in 2017. And when Thomas Wooden Railway was revived in early 2022, we got the most radical redesign in terms of the box and packaging that we have ever seen. Gone are the blue cardboard backing and the plastic window. Now you basically slide this open to view the engine inside. But the point I'm trying to make is that for the first 25 years of the line's existence, Thomas Wooden Railway packaging looked like this. And there were very few items that strayed away from this design, but there were some items that didn't follow the guidelines. In this video, I'm going to take a look at just a few examples I have of some weird examples of Thomas Wooden Railway packaging. And I guess we'll go chronologically. And by weird, I mean they just don't fit those guidelines we talked about earlier. They look a little bit strange. They fit and sit on the shelves just a little bit weird. And this is one of those examples. This is a later version of the express coaches. This is dated 2006, and the express coaches were very, very interesting. They replaced the Knapford express coaches in the late 90s, and the Knapford express coaches were always sold individually. So you had what I would call a normal Thomas Wooden Railway packaging here, the cardboard backing, the plastic window, but you only bought one coach at a time. When the express coaches were introduced in 1998, for some reason, they were bundled together. And this created a very unique piece of packaging that we got here. I'm not really sure why we were sold two express coaches at the same time. I'm not complaining by any means, but I think the short answer is that there were some really smart people at Learning Curve who realized, what the express was. It is a big train that Gordon, or a heavy, strong engine, usually pulls, and there are multiple coaches in the express. That's the whole thing. I think in the TV series, there was usually at least 3 coaches, and I think in later years of the CGI series, we got to see some more. But I think during the original model run, due to the limitations of the sets that the filmmakers were working on, they usually settled on 3 coaches. 2 coaches was just not enough. 4 coaches, I think, started to get into an area of like, that's a lot of model trains to put on a table and be in charge of. So 3 was always kind of the magical number. However, this piece of Thomas Wooden Railway packaging here is super unique because we get 2 items bundled together. And that creates for this weird, difference of one item at the front and one item at the back. And imagine how this would sit on the pegs. You have the metal peg that would go through the hole there, and this item, would sit like a normal item. But picking this up in stores for the first time as a kid, I remember being kind of aghast at how heavy it was and almost how premium it was. It felt like one of those, you're almost getting double your value. This was probably, a $25 item or so, in line with bigger engines like Gordon, or even value packs like, let's say, the Gold Prospectors cars or the Giggling Troublesome trucks. I mean, they definitely weren't selling you 2 express coaches for cheap. But there was definitely a design change that had to happen with this packaging because you were selling 2 big coaches at once. For example, Annie and Clarabelle were sold together in the early 2000s, and those are 2 coaches, but they are not the same length as the express coaches. So this style of packaging has always mesmerized me because it is just very, very unique. The early versions of this packaging in the 90s were probably on the more flimsy side. This is what most people call like the anti-theft packaging from the mid-2000s. And so the plastic here is a little bit thicker. There's like this space at the bottom here that I think kind of like helps the overall support. Because when you think about it, what's holding these 2 coaches in place is just cardboard and glue. And you do want it to remain relatively stable, but these items aren't exactly the lightest either. So the express coaches have always been kind of a weird item for me to take a look at. I never owned any new in box. I bought them new in box many, many years ago, but it wasn't until a couple years ago I picked up this basically a 2-pack with the express coaches together, and you kind of actually get this weird look at both coaches sitting side by side. I wonder if anybody has any stories out there of them walking into a toy store and some of the glue has come off or anything like that. But yeah, this is just a very unique piece. I love it though. I think it's great, and I think it's awesome that the folks at Learning Curve were smart enough to know, hey, the Express is not just one coach. You need multiple coaches for the train to be called the Express. And they were not going to let, a normal style of Thomas Wooden Railway packaging get in the way of them giving us, what we wanted. So right off the bat, you can probably tell the items we're going to take a look at in this video are just different items. They're bigger. They require a little bit more, love and care than just your typical Thomas in a normal box. And another item that later received some kind of weird packaging, it's very similar to the Express Coach packaging, but it's Harold, and he is basically cocooned in this plastic window here all the way around. Harold was not sold like this for a number of years. He was actually just stuck in a plain cardboard box for the early years of his life. There was a plastic version, and then there was the cardboard version. And the weird thing about the cardboard box is that it was never fitted with a handle or an open space up here. So Harold could never be displayed on the pegs next to his other characters. I actually have memories of walking into a local toy store, and the Harolds would kind of be all over the place because they couldn't hang on the pegs next to the other trains and the other characters. They were kind of put down low next to like the destinations and kind of like the bigger items. And I think that was a bit of a disadvantage for Harold. Not that it affected his sales numbers by any means. There's plenty of, Harolds out there. But it was almost like Harold just like wasn't cool enough to sit at the cool kids table at lunch or something like that. However, there was a version of Harold that was released near the mid-2000s that actually had a magnet on the bottom. And I believe the main reason for redoing the packaging is that you would want to show off this really cool play feature that's now included in Harold. Whereas you put him in a cardboard box, of course, you could mock up the box and, do your best to describe, hey, this is a cool Harold. You spin, his blades up top and the magnet lowers and he can pick up cargo, and that's really cool. But I honestly, there's a saying like it's better to show than to tell. Don't really let your words do the talking, like let the visuals do the talking. And I think that's exactly what they did with Harold. So there was a version of Harold that had the magnet on the bottom, but then after they discontinued that version of Harold and just came back with, what I would call a normal Harold here, they kept this, very open box. And like I said, it's very reminiscent of the Express coaches, but Harold is just a wider character. And especially with his propellers, you can kind of see just like the surface area, he covers. No matter where any of his propellers are at the same time, they actually reach out over where he is. So you kind of do need to give him like a bigger box, even though Harold is definitely not the most gigantic character in the Thomas Wooden Railway line. This item is dated 2012. But it's actually labeled learning curve at the bottom, which is really interesting. So this version of Harold was sold for a couple of years, but then when Fisher-Price took over the brand in 2013, they introduced their own version of Harold, which is a tiny bit smaller. It's not my favorite version of Harold, but they actually made Harold stick to a normal cardboard backing with the plastic. The molded plastic is a little bit different, but gone are the days of this like really, really big packaging. I should have mentioned this with the express coaches, but looking at Harold here honestly takes me back to like the very early days of like the take-along range when those were first introduced, because the packages on those, you were meant to almost like spin the characters in a circle and get like a 360-degree view of the engines while they're still in the box, which is really cool. We never really had that with Thomas Wooden Railway. We only could see about, a little over 50% of the engine if you kind of turned it, on its side and we're looking on the front and the back. But then this back area, wasn't see-through. So there could have been airs or something on the other side. You wouldn't really know until you got it out of the packaging and you were able to look at it for the first time. So again, like the express coaches, Harold is just kind of given this really big area to basically live in. And I kind of mentioned it. It was like a cocoon of sorts, because that really is what it reminds me of. But again, think of the shelf space that Harold would take up. The card is not necessarily any bigger, like lengthwise. It's more of Harold's width. And, you would maybe, let's say, fit like 7 or 8 Thomases in a row on the pegs. Well, Harold, you may only be able to fit like 4, for example, because he's just a wider character. So I wouldn't be surprised at this point Harold was still being made by Learning Curve if the designers or the engineers at the company use their learnings from the express coaches here. Maybe this was sort of prototype is always a loaded word, but maybe there was some inspiration used here when they were designing this express coach 2-pack, to actually help Harold fit in this packaging and get him on the shelves next to his friends instead of being just tossed off to the side in sort of a bland cardboard box. So the express coaches in Harold were pretty similar looking boxes, but let's transition to one Thomas Wooden Railway item that I remember seeing back in the stores, like in Toys R Us back in the day, and this always threw me for a loop. Are you able to tell like what's different about this Thomas Wooden Railway packaging? It's not the snowman. It's not that the snowman is really big or anything like that, but Thomas is technically facing the wrong way. If I bring back a piece of Thomas packaging from the era, all of the characters from 1992 to 2017, basically we'll call it face to the left. Their left side was exposed to people in the toy store, and this was always how it was done. In fact, nowadays, if you go on eBay and you see people selling trains that the character is facing the other way, let's say facing to the right, you can always tell if it is definitely new in box because the engines were always pointed to the left. It gets a little bit trickier back in the day with this style of packaging. This is not like the anti-theft packaging and has flaps on both sides, so people could easily, and they regularly did, take the engines out, examine them, put them back in, and unless you're like, a Thomas Wooden Railway diehard who talks about these toys on the internet, most people are probably not going to remember which way Thomas was facing. However, I've always thought that the characters facing to the left looked more natural. That was just my opinion. But the Thomas and the Snowman car is a weird one. Thomas is facing to the right. And I said it didn't have, anything to do with how big the snowman was, but that's kind of a lie because it definitely does. This is a very big piece of rolling stock here. It's actually so big that it doesn't fit underneath bridges and tunnels, for example. It's based on an episode And, there was a lot of synergy between the brands at the time, between the TV show and the merchandise ranges, where if there was a special item used or, displayed in an episode, you would bet your bottom dollar that the merchandise ranges would be doing their best to create that item so that you could reenact the episode, let's say. The back of the box is actually very, very normal. Nothing really much to see there, but having Thomas face the other way was always really peculiar for me, and I didn't quite understand it. I knew it had something to do with the size of the snowman here, but let's actually, kind of dive into, well, why would they have to flip this around to begin with? I always thought it was due to weight. I was thinking maybe because this is such a big piece here, maybe it's heavier or something like that. And maybe when you put it on the shelves or on the pegs, I should say, it's hanging there and maybe there was an issue of it being like super lopsided or something. So maybe they decided to flip it around. But the more I thought about that theory, it doesn't really hold up because, well, if you were to flip Thomas around, have him face to the left, the snowman moves over here. I mean, there's still going to be weight distribution problems if that is the problem. Instead of tilting, let's say, this way because this piece is heavier, well, if you flip things around, the snowman is over here, well, it's going to tilt this way. So I just assumed that, it had something to do with weight. And even like holding this item, I mean, this is not scientific at all, but it doesn't feel, it is kind of a little bit lopsided. I think it's more me like holding this area up here. But my point is after thinking about this, I don't think that's the case. I actually think it has to do with this yellow ribbon right here. These are always super important in, advertising to parents and kids, hey, what the item is. If you're not familiar with the merchandise range, this is a really good way to actually tell you, oh, it is a normal Thomas, but it is Thomas and the Snowman car. I think it has to do with how this label was placed. If we take a look back to Thomas, for example, all of these smaller items always had these labels relatively in the center. And even if I bring Harold in here, the size and the shape of the label always changed, but for the most part, it was always in the center. Back in the day, as Thomas Wooden Railway packaging has changed, there's always been an identifier for the characters or the item. It's changed location. Sometimes it's on the cardboard backing, sometimes it's on the plastic, but really through all the different versions of classic Thomas Wooden Railway, we've always had this identifier there. With the Thomas and the Snowman car, however, you can see that this label is definitely smaller and it's not in the center. It's been pushed off to the side here because this snowman figure is so big. And I think I realized why Thomas and the Snowman were put in this configuration. And it has to do with that idea as if we took Thomas, flipped him around, he's facing to the left, the snowman would follow him. The label here fits in sort of this valley or this little open area between the height of the snowman and Thomas. And if we were to flip them around, this label basically stays above Thomas and it moves over here. Well, now you have this issue of potentially two labels right on top of each other. One is the yellow label, but then we also have the Thomas and Friends Wooden Railway logo right there. And based on like a casual glance, they wouldn't run into each other necessarily. I think this is set far enough down that they wouldn't intrude on each other's space. But from a aesthetic point of view, and especially from a branding point of view, a company trying to sell toys and make them look nice, I think there would have been an issue having this yellow label basically like right here being directly under the Thomas and Friends Wooden Railway logo. It would have been like two identifiers too close to each other. And I think that is the main reason why they flip Thomas around, so that you kind of bounce back and forth and sort of meet somewhere in the middle. Like you have the item identifier here, you have like the range logo, and then you even have like stickers at the bottom and other pieces of information as you look at this toy. I really think that's the reason. I think that this yellow label would have been just too close to the Thomas and Friends Wooden Railway logo at the top there. And really, it's not that big of a deal, but just imagine, you walking into a Toys R Us like 10 or 15 years ago and seeing this item, and it throws you off because you are so used to Thomas facing this way, and every other character on the shelf is facing to the left, and then all of a sudden It's like Thomas didn't get the right instructions. He didn't follow Simon Says or something like that, and he's facing the wrong way. Again, for the longest time, I thought this was due to weight. I thought it would sit really weird, but the more I think about it, I just think that, potentially due to some branding reasons, the people at Learning Curve decided to move it over to this side, which involved them basically flipping this train and making it, face to the right instead of that usual facing to the left. And the final item we're going to take a look at in this video is this very interesting musical caboose, or as it's labeled, musical carriage. If you're knowledgeable about Thomas Wooden Railway, you may recognize I talked about that anti-theft packaging. Well, that packaging was not introduced in areas of Europe for a long time. So as we get into, let's say, this is labeled 2007, for example, but even, into the 2010s and stuff, Thomas Wooden Railway was still sold in what I would call like this classic style of packaging with the flaps on the side. The plastic is a bit thinner. But what's interesting about this item is, again, that location of that yellow label we were talking about. I find this to be very interesting because it is put on the front of the packaging, kind of where you would be looking at it like eye level if it was, hanging on the shelves or on the pegs in a store. For example, we'll bring back the express coaches here. The label is put on the top, and I think that is done to leave this space open so that you can see the beautiful artwork, and so you can just plainly see the item better. And the reason why the yellow label on the musical caboose is in this different spot is because this item has the option to press this button up here to hear some music, hence the name. Unfortunately, mine is old, it no longer works, but there was this little bit of a demonstration area that Learning Curve wanted you to try out. And like we just saw with the express coaches, normally the label, the item identifier label, goes across the top here, leaves this area completely open. Well, now you have sort of this demonstration area that is full, has its own sticker, and has all of these instructions in various different languages. And it's like, well, where do you put the item identifier label? In later years of Thomas Wooden Railway, especially when Mattel took over, you can see that item identifier label is not even a sticker anymore. It's actually part of the cardboard box. And so this was kind of like a fail-safe thing. Hey, we're going to use this blank area up here. That's where we're going to put this label so that you very clearly know what item you're getting into. That's not really an option with this style of packaging because, as you can tell, Learning Curve decided to focus on some other areas they wanted to draw attention to. They have this real wood logo, which we've seen on a couple of different items. And then they also had their company's logo here. And so, personally, I'm not saying this is like a great choice to use this space. They haven't really spaced the logos out that well. I mean, it looks fine. I'm no graphic designer. And even with the names such as musical carriage, it's so long, unless they shrunk it down really small, it's probably going to sit on two lines there. But you have to remember that there were, many different toys being produced in this style. They probably were not going to suddenly change their brand guidelines and their brand identity to put a label here, whereas all of the other characters, they are normally having their identifier yellow labels up top here, and this space is clear, and then this space they can, choose to say, hey, it's for kids 2 years and older, and that type of stuff. But what makes this item unique is obviously the yellow label being down on the bottom here, and I actually wanted to talk about the placement a little bit. It's not directly in the center of this plastic window here. It's like 2/3 of the way down, like say it's like a third from the bottom. It's not in the middle, but it's also not like butted up against like the plastic crease here. I think this was done intentionally because they still want you to be able to see the design on the carriage. It's definitely not, in the way. It's not like you're, looking to the side trying to see like what beautiful artwork they have. But it's also not low enough to really cover the wheels. But I think with an item like this, I mean, it is out of the way. We're seeing the good stuff right here. And honestly, my guess, because this is like a sticker that was put on the packaging, they probably had some, rule or something where, you weren't supposed to put it any lower than a certain area so that there is no issue of the sticker being too low, like I said, getting on that crease, and then for some reason if it was placed on that crease, it could easily come off, and then you have this issue of you don't know what this item is called if you're not familiar with the brand. So this is a very unique one. This is actually an item that I was not aware of that was sold in this configuration. And even, when this item was sold in the United States, the packaging is a little bit different, but as you can tell, that item identifier label or sticker had to be moved as well, because up top here, we had this opportunity to basically test out this item. And again, we're talking about, show and don't tell. Well, they could have, hidden this area here, and you basically would have to trust learning curve. Like, yeah, they say it's a musical caboose and they say you can press a button, but there is something really powerful about basically being able to test out the item in the store. Imagine a little kid walking up and, touching the item and hearing the music play. And in a weird way, you already establish a connection between the child and the toy. The child was able to press a button. There's an action and there's a response. And I'm not saying that this directly led to massive sales with the musical caboose, but, just that type of stuff became a lot more prominent. It's a reason why in the early 2000s, a lot of items were hidden behind cardboard. We talked about Harold for a while, but even, 3-packs such as like Rheneas and the Rock Crusher cars, they all gradually got updated to include these clear plastic windows so that you could directly see into the box and you could tell exactly the type of item you were getting. I think that's a very powerful marketing tool, and like I said, it helps establish a connection between the person potentially looking at buying the toy and then maybe them actually going through it. I will say that is, maybe one of the disadvantages to the new style of Thomas Wooden Railway packaging. You can easily slide this open and take a look at the engine inside, but when it's sitting here on the shelves, we are used to that plastic window there and being able to see actually our Thomas that we may potentially purchase. You actually have to take a little bit of action here, which I don't think is that much of a stretch because it's very clearly labeled what you have to do, and I think kids would get a kick out of like this sliding motion. It is a little bit of magic. You slide it open, but then it catches, and so you can't, completely break the item out yet, but it's a very nice way. It's a more modern way of displaying toys, and honestly, it might actually have something to do if they were trying to reduce the amount of plastic used in the packaging versus going to something completely made out of cardboard here. Regardless, this is still a unique item in the fact that this yellow label is positioned in sort of a weird spot. And I did think initially it was placed in a weird area. Again, it wasn't in the middle, it wasn't at the top, it wasn't at the bottom. But the more I look at it, the top of the label kind of lines up like with the running board of the caboose back there. And I guess it makes sense. It still makes for a very interesting item to look at. And what's really interesting, not really the point of this video, but I thought I'd call out that there is a character card included and it is labeled musical carriage, whereas the actual item appears to have never been officially changed. The printing process that they use is still called musical caboose. I would just have to imagine that's just the difference between like American and British English. Maybe they thought the word carriage would do a lot better. From what I understand, caboose is more of an American term. That's like why we never heard the spiteful brake van called like the spiteful caboose or something like that, or even the very classic Sodor line caboose more accurately could have probably been called like the Sodor line brake van or something like that. But you have to remember Learning Curve was an American company, so they were first and foremost thinking about American interests, and then maybe in situations like this they would do a little bit of editing to maybe reach their target audience a little bit better. And yeah, those are some examples of just some weird Thomas Wooden Railway packaging I've kind of noticed over the years. The ones that if you saw them in person back in the day, you'd kind of do a little bit of a double take because they're just unique. Ever since Fisher-Price took over Thomas Wooden Railway in 2013, there really haven't been too many different variations of Thomas Wooden Railway packaging, and then especially with the 2022 revival, all of the individual single engines basically remain remain the same. But Learning Curve produced hundreds of thousands of these toys over the years, and I'm really glad they kind of gave us a few interesting ones here and there just to kind of mix it up, you know, when you were looking at all the toys on the shelf. Again, this is not supposed to be an exhaustive list by any means. There are some other examples out there, specifically in other countries other than the United States. Overseas, there are some, you know, unique examples of single packs being bundled together and stuff like that. So I'm not saying this is everything out there, but these are the main ones that I've been able to collect over the years that, again, you just kind of look at and they make you ponder a bit. What's really interesting and kind of an afterthought in this whole discussion is that because these items, you know, display a little bit differently, Thomas and the Snowman car and the musical carriage are actually not really relevant for this discussion, but specifically Harold and the express coaches, because they are so, well, fat, for lack of a better term, it's actually hard to display them on the wall. Again, they were meant to kind of float on pegs on the shelves, or even be used, you know, sitting down like this. But, you know, I hang a lot of my stuff with command hooks on the wall, so the back of the item is right up against the wall. And, you know, you'd have the wall right here and the hook, and Harold would basically hang like this. And same thing with the express coaches. It's just kind of awkward. So I actually don't really choose to display these two items just because they kind of hang a little bit differently. And, you know, unfortunately, they do kind of call attention to themselves, which isn't a bad thing, but they also don't really look great when they hang like that. And that's going to do it for this video on some special examples of Thomas Wooden Railway packaging over the years. 99.9% of the items produced by Learning Curve and Fisher-Price kind of abide by some same set of guidelines and rules, but as we've just seen, there were a few outliers here and there. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, maybe got you thinking a little bit about some of the weirder items you've seen over the years. And yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.